A half-century ago, Americans broke ground on a 40,000-mile road to the future.
The interstate system is the largest civil engineering project ever in the world.
But in the 1950s, most Americans were not impressed.
I couldn't believe that they'd ever build the whole thing. At that time, no one realized what it would do.
What we couldn't envision 50 years ago, we can't live without today.
Interstate highways certainly tied the country more closely together.
Nowhere is that more apparent than in Virginia. The interstates have driven the old Dominion into the new millennium, feeding the economy, making the remote accessible, changing our landscape and our lifestyle.
In many ways, the interstate has turned into Main Street.
Connecting the Commonwealth, 50 years of Virginia's interstates. When the sun arose on Saturday, June 30th, 1956, Virginians had plenty to chat about. Women were talking about the Elvis Presley concert that night in Richmond. Plenty of seats were still available for $1.50. Men were lamenting the news of Marilyn Monroe's marriage to playwright Arthur Miller the previous night. Everyone was talking about the weather as the thermometer hit the mid-90s in parts of the Commonwealth. It's a safe bet to say few people were discussing the Federal Aid Highway Act, just signed by President Eisenhower. By establishing the first dedicated source of money to pay for the Interstate Highway System, the act would forever change the way Virginians and Americans travel. But in 1956, few seemed to notice. An article in the Richmond News Leader never mentioned the interstates, but rather focused on the 1 cent per gallon tax hike. Though it lacked the glitz and glamour of Elvis or Marilyn, the Federal Aid Highway Act had one very important fan. When President Eisenhower took office in 1953, he recognized the value of a national highway system. Only a few years earlier, while leading Allied forces into Germany, he had witnessed the speed and efficiency of the 4-lane Autobahn. His vision for a similar road in the U.S. was to be realized in the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. With the federal government paying 90% of the costs, construction of the modern interstate system was now in the acceleration lane. Eventually, more than 40,000 miles of interstate highways would be built, over 1,000 miles in Virginia alone. Today, Virginia's motorists can climb, and sometimes pass through, high mountains that once isolated us. We can travel over, and sometimes under, great bodies of water that once hemmed us in. As a result of the interstate system, Virginians easily commute from town to town, traveling greater distances in shorter amounts of time than their grandparents ever imagined.
Depends on the person's age.
Scott Kozel is a self-described transportation buff. His Roads to the Future website is a clearinghouse of information on highways in Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C.
Maybe somebody 10 years or more older than me could remember when there were no interstates, whereas a person, say, maybe 20 or 25 years old, they wouldn't have any memory of what it was like before the interstates.
The reaction that I heard from a lot of folks was that they just couldn't believe that the plan across the nation was to build 40,000 miles of interstate highway, and that there'd be enough traffic to warrant a roadway of that type. Well, I couldn't believe that they'd ever build the whole thing. I thought they'd build parts of it in certain areas, but I couldn't visualize that it would be built from coast to coast.
Well, we heard about it in the news, but it wasn't any great shakes as far as a senior in college. I mean, I was looking for a job, and the interstate system never entered my mind. It hit every highway department nationwide the same way. There weren't enough people. Matter of fact, when I reported for work in Fairfax, I was the 12 people they asked for.
The Virginia Department of Highways was not only understaffed, it was under pressure. There would be little orientation time for new engineers.
We were acquiring right-of-way so fast we couldn't build behind it. And we actually ended up with rodent control, where we had torn down the buildings until we could get there with the idea. And here I am, a civil engineer, trying to get rid of rats.
A much greater challenge to the interstates came from the organized opposition groups that soon formed. For the next 2 decades, construction was held up by actions legal and not so legal.
I-66 inside the Beltway, there's a lot of controversy, and that project was held up in the courts. After 20 years, they finally got started in 1978 to build I-66 inside the Beltway. There was a lot of opposition to the project. Groups in Arlington didn't want the project. There was a lot of vandalism of the contractor's equipment. They'd put sand or gravels in the like the dozers in the fuel tanks. They even tried to keep some of the pickup trucks and dump trucks and so forth in a compound. They'd put paint in balloons and throw it over the fence and end up with paint all over the contractor's equipment.
Interstate construction was impeded not only by paint-throwing vandals, but by mudslinging politicians. Bitter political feuds erupted over where the roads would be built.
There was a faction between Lynchburg and Charlottesville. To me, 64 was located politically. If you ask the pure engineer, 64 likely should have followed 60 and crossed the mountain and tied into Lexington where it ties now without having that overlap. But there was a lot of political people, even after they decided to put it at Charlottesville, there was a big argument whether to put it around Charlottesville to the north or the south.
Okay, we're heading north on I-95, Chesterfield County, approaching the Route 895 Pocahontas Parkway interchange, and this ramp going off here, it's sort of steep, but it's certainly within interstate standards.
It's October 1949, and you're cruising on Virginia's first limited access road, the Shirley Highway between Woodbridge and the Potomac River. With 2 lanes in each direction, cars pass easily and safely. With freshly painted signs and smooth concrete surface, the new road has an almost pristine look. It's an impressive freeway, but not quite up to snuff.
And the Shirley Highway was not to interstate standards because it had some beautiful, beautiful arched bridges. But you couldn't widen the Shirley Highway. You had to tear the bridges down. Every crossroad that's there now, from Woodbridge to Franconia Road, the bridges were very pretty, beautifully architecturally designed arches, but you couldn't widen them. So we had to tear them down.
In other parts of the Commonwealth, interstate construction has been an uphill struggle.
I don't know that maybe people on the eastern side of the state really can appreciate what it took to cross Christiansburg Mountain and to cross Afton Mountain, to overcome the tremendous physical sizes.
Gary Allen grew up in the shadow of Afton Mountain and recalls the days before Interstate 64.
We always went to the Virginia Beach for summer vacation. It was a grand time. We didn't have air conditioning in the car. I remember that. It was a long drive. Well, you know, in an old hot car, you know, with all the windows down and your younger brother just raising Cain. It was a horrible, horrible trip. Horrible trip. Oh my gosh, 7 hours. A whole day just to get there. Then you had a whole day to come home. There was no such thing as going to the beach for the weekend. With the interstate, you get in a car, you can be from the mountains to the beach in 3.5 hours, max. People go to the beach for the weekend all the time. That's the difference. That's the difference.
Urban freeways can be very beneficial, but they also can have some huge impacts. You've got houses, you've got businesses, neighborhood businesses, you've got churches, schools, some historical sites in some situations.
It was really quite phenomenal when you stop to think about the relocation program that came out of the interstate system. It compensated folks. It offered them opportunities to move from being renters to becoming homeowners.
While many initially embraced the move, others did not.
You couldn't convince them it's worthwhile. You can't convince anybody that the road is going to take your house is worth it.
As property or right-of-way was being purchased in urban areas, one fact was becoming increasingly apparent.
Highways tend to go through the least expensive neighborhoods. When I-64 went through in the Hampton Roads area, there were low-income communities that were very, very closely knit. that were bisected as a result of that interstate.
As Interstate 81 was being built, it took some of the state's valued agricultural land.
I remember an elderly lady in Southwest Virginia. And I went to her house, got to set up the interview. She came out on the front porch of the farmhouse, and she sat down on the swing, and we talked to her for the longest time about her new place and being relocated and all those kinds of things. And she told us that her husband had passed away. She was convinced as a result of the stress associated with the move. And that got very close to me. On balance, the benefits far, far outweighed the costs or the negative impacts. But there were some negative impacts. There's just no doubt about it.
I remember seeing some newspaper articles citing various officials in the Clifton Forge, Covington, Allegheny County area saying that they'd been historically very isolated, and with the completion of I-64 across North Mountain to connecting into I-81 and I-64 further to Richmond and Hampton Roads, that had really ended their historical isolation.
It's 1971 and you're driving on U.S. Route 21 as it snakes its way up Big Walker Mountain. The 23-mile drive from your home in Bland County to your job in Wytheville takes 45 minutes, if the weather is nice. Fortunately, today is clear and calm. You would never suspect that a few hundred feet below you is a flurry of activity that will have a dramatic impact on your life. The construction of the I-77 tunnels through Big Walker Mountain took nearly 5 years to complete. Millions of tons of rock and earth were removed to create the 4,200-foot passage. At a cost of nearly $50 million, this stretch of I-77 was the most expensive project along Virginia's interstate system. But its economic benefit to the residents of Bland County is incalculable. When its sister, the East River Mountain Tunnel, was completed in 1974, this once remote area now had a link to industries in the Midwest and sunny vacation spots in the South. Closer to home, that 23-mile drive to Wytheville was cut almost in half. The 45-minute commute now took less than 15 minutes. There are similar stories throughout Virginia. Though he grew up just 30 miles from Charlottesville, Gary Allen recalls that the town across Afton Mountain seemed a world away.
I can count on one hand the number of times I was in Charlottesville. Charlottesville was not a place anybody went because you had to cross the mountain. And that was a phenomenal barrier to most folks. Going miles, sometimes not being able to pass a truck that was in front of you. Never being able to average 55 miles an hour. That interstate across that mountain made a huge difference in terms of the economic growth and bringing together the valley with east of the Blue Ridge Mountains.
There was just a tremendous amount of difficulty in getting through the mountains. The blasting that had to be done, stabilization of the rock. There's some places of Interstate 81, you drive through these walls of rock where whole sides of mountains had to be moved.
To build the interstates, engineers have moved mountains, but they could never part the sea. So in Tidewater, they did the next best thing. For centuries, the waters of Hampton Roads had separated the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area from Newport News and Hampton. Though only 3.5 miles apart, the Peninsula and Southampton Roads were separate communities.
If you wanted to go from Norfolk to Newport News, you went by ferry. Can you imagine how many ferries we'd have to have? You'd just probably hook them together and drive across from one to the other because you just couldn't get it as it is now.
Everything began to change in the 1950s with the building of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. It opened in 1957 and operated as a two-lane toll road. In the 1970s, funding from the Interstate Highway System paid for the construction of an adjacent bridge tunnel. With this money in place, the tolls were removed when the expanded four-lane Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel opened in 1976. When the Monitor Merrimack Memorial Bridge Tunnel opened in 1992, it linked Newport News and Hampton with Suffolk, Portsmouth, and Chesapeake via I-664.
Those tunnels and taking the tolls off changed the whole complexion of Tidewater. That has opened up Virginia Beach to an incalculable level for tourism, economic development.
The study called The Best Investment Ever Made by Wendell Cox and Gene Love, they believe the economic benefits was probably equal to at least 3 or 4 times the cost of building the interstate system. And it certainly has turned our country into the economic powerhouse that it is.
There was a whole shift or a redistribution of economic activity that came about because of the interstate system.
They're putting one of them super highways through here.
Well, that's good, isn't it?
And a pig's eye it is. They're going to run it a half a mile west of here.
Oh.
They're going to run me right out of business. Been here 13 years, and that's what I get.
There clearly have been some adverse economic impacts of the interstate system on small towns. If you look at just the state of Virginia, you had Route 60, Route 250, Route 522, major north-south corridor was Route 11, Route 29. All along those primary routes were mom-and-pop businesses, hotels, motels, restaurants that survived because the traffic had nowhere else to go other than on those primary routes. The mom-and-pop businesses now, for the most part, are gone. Now, rather than the mom-and-pops, you have at every interchange major corporations, fast food chains. All of that grew out of the interstate era.
Small roadside businesses were not alone in feeling the new highways had passed them by. Other major transit companies saw their clients and profits jump the track.
There was a transition in terms of freight movement that occurred because of the interstate system. I don't think anybody anticipated what the impact on the railroads would be.
The rail lines just don't go everywhere that commerce needs to go, and so a lot of shipping now is, more than ever, is done by truck, and I only see that expanding.
The interstate system really is a substitute for fixed location warehouses. It's really a rolling warehouse.
Fresh vegetables that we get, and how we get them in the grocery store, and how instant just-in-time delivery really has become for manufacturing. So I think it's affected our way of living and our way of doing business in more ways than probably anyone could describe.
This is the overlap of I-64 and I-95, 3 miles long, carries both interstate highways. And I think the average daily traffic is, I believe it's over 120,000.
When I came to Springfield project, the volume on Shirley Highway was 26,000. Today in the interchange there, it's over 450,000.
It's 2006 and you're driving through one of the largest construction projects in American history, the Springfield Interchange. At this junction in Northern Virginia, traffic from 3 interstates converges into one giant dance floor. Each day, hundreds of thousands of vehicles meet to perform a waltz on wheels. Partners are changed every few seconds without so much as a bow or curtsy. Show up on a weekday morning or afternoon, and you will find it is a slow dance. The Springfield Interchange project is estimated to take 8 years to complete. More than 50 bridges will be constructed and some areas will be widened to 24 lanes. The cost? About $675 million. That's a high price, but hosting 500,000 dancers a day demands a grand ballroom.
In the interstate system, we're looking at how we can move and manage traffic.
Nick Nicholson is the project manager at the new Woodrow Wilson Bridge. Like the older span it is replacing, the new bridge will connect Virginia and Maryland via Interstates 95 and 495 across the Potomac River. This is one of the busiest sections of interstate on the East Coast. The old bridge now carries 3 times the number of daily vehicles it was designed to support.
This stretch of the Capitol Beltway handles over 200,000 vehicles a day currently, projected to grow to over 300,000 vehicles a day in our design year of 2020. Well, as traffic grew in the region of Northern Virginia and the Washington metropolitan area, the traffic loads as well as interstate traffic just overwhelmed the 40-year-old structure, and there needed to be a replacement. Unlike the 60s when the interstate was built, we don't have the right-of-way now. The area has developed, real estate is at a premium. In the Woodrow Wilson Bridge project, this is an example of that, where we're squeezing this highway in a well-developed and historic area of Alexandria, Virginia. Woodrow Wilson Bridge goes through not just a historic area, but an environmentally sensitive area. The environmental permits on this project are weighed by the pound and not measured by the page. When the interstate system was originally constructed, that wasn't part of our process. The need to move traffic is steady going to grow, but we just can't afford to keep expanding our highway facilities, so we have to look at managing them better.
One way to manage traffic better is through smart traffic centers like this one in Chesapeake. VDOT personnel monitor traffic using a series of live video cameras posted along major roadways. When an incident occurs, emergency rescue vehicles are quickly summoned and traffic backups are minimized. These smart traffic centers will play an increasingly important role in the future.
Emphasis is going to have to be placed on operating what we have much smarter than we've ever had to do it before. There's just not going to be but so many more lanes we probably are going to be able to build. The roads have been hemmed in by so much very expensive and very dense development in Northern Virginia, and it's getting that way in Hampton Roads. I think that in the future we're going to have some very difficult time trying to make any kinds of capacity improvements. It's hard to imagine that Northern Virginia could look like Tokyo someday with double-decker lanes of traffic, but I guess we could go there. That's also very expensive construction.
How much money will be available and who will pay for it? Ironically, these are the same questions that held up interstate construction before 1956.
50 years from now, I do believe we will come to our senses and price roads, especially those that are really heavily congested. And I think we'll get smart about pricing. And we'll realize pricing holds the potential to generate an awful lot of revenue. In the next 50 years, local governments will realize that they can no longer afford to allow unbridled growth without attaching to that a requirement that developers pay for infrastructure.
A glimpse into the next 50 years of interstate travel can be found in Southwest Virginia along the 2.2-mile Smart Road. For now, the road is Virginia's most glamorous cul-de-sac and the world's premier transportation research facility. Built by the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute and VDOT, the Smart Road is actually a high-tech highway. 400 electronic sensors collect data from over a dozen pavement systems. Above ground, there are multiple experimental lighting systems. 75 towers are used to produce inclement weather, up to 2 inches of rain or 4 inches of snow per hour. Towering 171 feet above Wilson Creek, this span across Ellett Valley is more than one of Virginia's tallest bridges. Below its surface, an electronic nerve system monitors the effects of salt and chemical corrosion. Research gathered here is being developed into new products for making interstate and highway travel safer and more efficient. In what ways will Virginia's interstate system change in the next half century? We can only guess at the answer by looking back at the last 50 years and seeing how the interstates have changed us.
The fact that the United States has the highest standard of living in the world, you cannot discount the impact of the interstate on that.
Probably much before the 50s, where people were born and grew up was pretty much where they stayed their whole lives, and families were rooted for generations in the same area. And I think from a societal standpoint, you just can see a tremendous amount of movement all across the country. Families now are scattered all over the place. And largely, I think that's because of what a highly mobile society we've been able to be because of interstate traffic.
The interstate has turned into our lifeline for earning our paycheck, putting food on the table, getting health care for loved ones, providing an education for our children, and spending time with family and friends near and far away. The freedom to travel on the interstate gives us the freedom to live our lives. That wasn't on the minds of Americans in 1956 when the interstate era was born, and it isn't on our minds today. But our expectation is to go where we want to go, when we want to go, at any time, and at any place.